Welcome to the UIUC Talkshow. Our goal with this show is to introduce you to the most interesting people with the most interesting ideas. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Wolfram, which I would describe as someone who is sane in a way most people are crazy. So,
Okay,
that's
interesting. Thank you. That could be a positive thing to say, or it could be a negative thing to say. We'll find out. Go for it.
I think it's a very positive thing. It's something that I admire. But I want to focus the conversation, and the first question is that if you were in college today, what would your major be? Would you even go to college?
It's an interesting question. Okay, first question is, what would I be studying or interested in? So when I grew up in England, and I was a kid in the 1960s and so on, when space was the big thing.
Right.
As it was then, as it perhaps is again now, with a 50-year gap. And so, I followed all the various spacecraft and things like that. And I was interested in that partly because it seemed like the future, and I was interested in the future. And so, interested in that. Then from that, I got interested in physics and sort of studied physics as much as I could when I was like 10, 11, 12 years old. Ironically, a project that I kind of got interested in when I was 12 years old about the second law of thermodynamics, I'm finally finishing that project now.
Really?
So 50 years later. So that's a funny thing. But anyway, separate topic. But no, so I got interested in physics. It so happened that in the mid-1970s was kind of a golden age for physics. And so it was a time when quantum field theory was really discovering all kinds of things, all kinds of experimental results were coming in. It was super exciting field. So for me, that was sort of the obvious field to work on because it was the exciting field at the time. I mean, what you generally see in kind of the rhythm of how things work is, some methodological advances made. Maybe it's an experimental thing, maybe it's a methodological thing, maybe it's a theoretical thing, and then some field gets really exciting for 5 or 10 years because there's lots of low-hanging fruit to be picked. And, that meant that when I was a, mid-teenager or something, I could discover a bunch of things in physics which people still care about today because it happened to be a time when there was, juicy low-hanging fruit to pick. So the fact that I was doing physics was a consequence in large part of the fact that it was a hot thing at that time. And so when I went to college kind of early, and I was sort of, see, the problem is that when you ask a question like, what would I major in college in today, it depends on whether it was the same me with different, with the same kinds of constraints, whether it's whether it's kind of a different, a me that might have arisen in, modern times where different things are the exciting things. I mean, in the last few years, I get to see this from our summer camp and summer school and so on. Students come in every year, and they're always like, we want to study this kind of thing, where this is the popular thing of the time. So there was a brief period when it was blockchain. I think that one died too quickly because I think that one actually has an interesting tale. Then there's been a longer period when it's machine learning. Everybody wants to do machine learning.
Right.
That one, I think that wave is very crested at this point. And then, it's the question. So if you say, what would I study today? An awful lot of people go and study computer science in college. And this, I think, is not really the right thing. Because what is, the thing that we realize is, computation and computational X is the big sort of paradigmatic thing of our time. And that's, all these different fields, X for archaeology, zoology, whatever it is. There's a computational version of those fields that is going to be the future of those fields. And that's the thing people should want to study because there's going to be low-hanging fruit to be picked, and it's really an exciting thing to do. But then people say, okay, I'm going to do, I'm not sure they say it properly, but what they should be saying is, I want to do computational X. What do I need to do to get to being able to do computational X? Well, they sort of say that implicitly, and then they say, well, I better study computer science in college, okay, which I think is crazy. And I think because if you look at what is, computer science departments that have sort of a complicated story of what they actually teach, and, a lot of it ends up being, this is how to program in low-level languages, which I don't know whether anybody's going to care about in the future.
Right.
I mean, it's, when I first learnt about computers, when I first used a computer back in 1973, I programmed in an assembly language. And when I built my first big computer system in 1979, it was built in the C programming language, which was at that time kind of a newfangled thing to use. And people were still saying, oh, anything really serious, you have to build in an assembly language. And, turns out nobody says that anymore because that, we automated those layers. And so it isn't useful to, hand program things in assembly language. And I think, the thing that I've spent a large part of my life doing is trying to build sort of a higher level way of thinking about computation that doesn't require you to sort of be in the guts of the machine, programming the loop and saying this thing should be stored in memory in this place and so on. That is not something humans need to do, just as humans don't need to write assembly language. A large part of my life has been devoted to kind of building up this computational language that gets one away from that. And I think in terms of sort of the path of how do you get to computational X without going through sort of traditional computer science, this is a path that, I've spent a lot of effort trying to enable. But how does that relate to kind of what people should study in college? Well, if you study computer science, a large part of what you're studying is a bunch of the past. You're studying a bunch of, how to deal with computers at a low level. Actually, I think they stopped teaching assembly language, which is kind of a shame. But it's kind of a sign, because it's kind of like, well, there are these layers, and, the more and more gets automated, less and less is worth learning that way. So people, now in terms of computer science as a field that colleges teach, has various kinds of sort of application areas that have been bolted on to computer science as such, different ones in different schools, because they don't fit in any other department. That's sort of random. And if one of the, robotics is one that's often bolted on, computer security, cryptography, another bolt-on, machine learning is a sort of bolt-on, because it's like, what other department does it fit in? Even though the methods are much more like physics and things like that, it's or statistics. It's complicated. So, gosh, this is a complicated answer, isn't it? I think if I look at, it also depends on, there's another point, which is when I was a kid, I made this sort of meta discovery that you could learn things just by reading books, which was, that's all gotten a lot easier, because it's a lot easier to read things, to learn things by looking at things on the internet than it is by bicycling to the local library and finding a book. So, some people, like myself, for example, have a certain pattern of learning that is pretty good to teach yourself. For me, I can't learn stuff sort of cold in the abstract, but when I have some project I want to do, then I go learn a bunch of stuff, and then I get motivated to do it and so on. That's my way of doing things. That has little relationship to what the mode of learning that one gets in college. If for people who are in that sort of autodidact, learn it for yourself type thing, I don't know whether a college is the benefits of it are not so clear. I think there are plenty of people for whom the things, the methods of learning things that I've used just don't work, and they're not a good fit for personality or whatever. And then, college is a fine thing. Now, in terms of what subjects one studies in college, it depends what one wants to do. If one looks at the traditional export fields, that is, if you study this field, you can go and do all kinds of stuff. The winner historically has been physics. That's been the one where if you look at sort of the life stories of people who've gone on and, started molecular biology or started, a bunch of areas of computer science or whatever else, they studied physics. Why is that? I think it's because it's a quantitative field that has definite things, but it is not as kind of detailed as mathematics, and not as kind of, not as sort of formalistic as mathematics. It's more practical. It's like there's quantitative things, but you can study all kinds of stuff with them. Now, the details of studying particular areas of physics, I'm not sure how useful that is, but the general methodology has turned out to be a good export field. I think the other export fields that I think computer science is a little bit of an export field and has become in some places is becoming more of an export field. There are fields that, if well taught, are good export fields, like philosophy, if well taught, is a good export field for lots of kinds of things. I think for some areas, economics in certain kinds of teaching is probably a reasonable export field, but you don't see, so that's one consideration. But I think in and then the next question is, should you go to college at all, right? And the answer is, if you want to do software engineering, techie stuff, I don't think going to college is, it's not, it depends on, it may be a life stage type thing that's worth going to college for that, having that experience in life, so to speak. But in terms of, does it teach you to be a better programmer? I don't know. I know plenty of programmers who never went to college or went to college and studied something that had nothing to do with programming, never did a computer science course, and they are better programmers than the people. In fact, it's usually, honestly, it's a little bit of a bad sign sometimes when people say, I studied computer science, I did my 4 years, and now I'm a programmer. It's like, well, actually, many of the most sort of natural and talented programmers, don't need to go through programming school, so to speak. So I think that's, and I've seen, we've had a bunch of people at this company, for example, who have come to work here, without going to college, going to, some small amount of college and so on, and often very successful. And actually, one of the things that's ironic is that often those people have broader interests and knowledge than the people who've gone through the super fancy educational process. And, the people who've got Ph.D.s and so on, now some of them have broad interests, and particularly the ones who end up working at this company. But, sometimes it's like, I studied this for my Ph.D. for 6 years, and now that's what I do. And that's the only thing I know about and care about. And so that's a very long answer to what might have been a simple question. And I think probably the answer is, it really depends a lot on the person, how they learn things, and what they're actually interested in, which, you unfortunately find an awful lot of kids these days who've gone through school, they've done really well, and you say, what are you interested in? I don't know. I don't really know what I'm interested in. And then they'll go through college and they'll do well in college, and they'll get to the end and they'll say, what am I going to do next? And maybe they'll go to graduate school, or maybe they'll go to the career fair and they'll see, who has the best candy, and then they'll be working for, big company X. And then, maybe they'll wake up a few decades later and say, oh, maybe I should have done something different. But that's, I think it's always great when people have sort of things that they realize they're interested in. Sometimes people have things that they're interested in, and they're like, how could I make a living doing this thing? There's something they're interested in, but it's like they don't know how to get there from here, so to speak. I think the thing to say is, particularly for people who are young and modern times and so on, it's, with creativity, it's possible to make a living doing all kinds of things. I mean, who knew you could make a living, professionally playing video games,
right?
Or being a YouTube influencer, talking about this or that. It's it requires a certain tenacity and a certain kind of entrepreneurial spirit to get those kinds of things to work. But it isn't the case that people should just say, well, I am interested in this, but I can't do that because, I'll never be able to get a job doing that. I can't learn that in school. I've got to do these standard things. And, I think that's a shame, because I think people can, with creativity, it's often possible to find those things. I mean, you could be unlucky and you could have a thing you're really interested in that at this time in history just isn't possible, or just isn't, you could be interested in discovering the source of the Nile or something. But sorry, that's one's been done. Or you could be interested in, taking a trip to a different star system. Well, sorry, it's too early to do that. But usually there are, I think it's with a little bit of creativity, that's the problem to solve, so to speak. And I think that should inform what people study in college. Another thing I might comment about college, I'll make two, since you asked me about college, and since, first point is that in almost any large college, there are all kinds of interesting things to find to do. Point one. Point two, there are professors at colleges, and one of the things, at least the brief time when I was a professor, one of the things that kind of shocked me is students never come to talk to you. And turns out maybe I was too horrifying a professor, I don't know, but students don't make use of, in many cases, the ability, professors, some of them may have a bad day or maybe otherwise, maybe jerks, who knows, but most of the time, student comes in, has an interesting question, professor is going to be pleased, student gets all kinds of useful interaction. I think that's one thing that another thing is, taking random courses about things that you'll never otherwise learn about in your life is a good strategy. Because, if you take that one course about this or that, I mean, a famous sort of pseudo-historical example is, Steve Jobs with his calligraphy course, so to speak. That story has some embellishment to it, but let's...
it works.
Yeah, right. I think, this point of there are things to learn in college that you'll never get around to learning any other time in life, probably. I've been lucky enough that I've done all kinds of different projects on all kinds of different things, and so I have gradually learnt all kinds of stuff about all kinds of different areas. It helps that my main life goal has been building this computational language that makes everything computable, so to speak,
right.
Which means that I kind of have a driver for learning about everything, so to speak. But that's that's an unusual case. Anyway, very long answer to what seemed like a simple question.
And I think that there's something very interesting about this idea that you can go through school and you can come out of and you don't know what you're interested in. And I think for me, college has been a place where I stopped caring so much about what is the college telling you what you should do, and more about what are hypotheses I could create and test out to see what I actually like. So random class, I was taking art history. I've done stand-up comedy, completely unprepared in front of 300 people, just to see and test out a lot of hypotheses and see what I'm actually interested in, which you can come out of the other side. You're so sad. What do you want to do with your life? Oh, I want to work at X company because, I'm doing computer science, it's for the money, right, type of thing. And, that's another good point that you said, a lot of people are doing computer science, and in a way, that's kind of the only major that has some sort of demand for jobs. And so a lot of people are doing it for the money and so on. And it's really sad to see that and not doing what you love doing.
Well, it depends on what, the problem is there is a whole lot of kind of drone computer science out there. That is, you do all this stuff, you study all these things, and then you're optimizing a piece of JavaScript code for the next, however long. And that's kind of it seems pretty boring to me. There are people for whom that really is interesting, and that's fine, but if you look at their trajectory in school, it's often doing things which are much more sort of intellectually kind of rich than that. I think this question of sort of what do people do? Well, an awful lot of the sort of high-end fancy kids go into finance kinds of areas, which I don't know, I have many friends in those areas. The people in those areas use our technology a lot, so that's nice. But it is a weird thing in the world that, it is true that if you want to make money, being close to the money is kind of a good strategy, so to speak. If you want to make, and I think it is a little bit shocking that the fraction of kind of sort of the very high-end, very successful students who go into that kind of area. I think it's been somewhat cyclical, but by the way, in computer science, I don't know, you have to pick your area. If you get into an area that happens to be a low supply, high demand at the time when you are in it, you are the first machine learning engineer. You're the first person who knows, how to do containerization. You're the first person who knows this or that. That's a pretty good deal. And it's also more interesting, probably, than being the, 25,000th person who knows about this or that thing. What it takes to be the first person who knows about one of these things, well, there probably isn't a class in your university about that thing because none of the professors know about it yet. Right. So, so that means, how do you get to that point? And, is it useful to have that base of, again, the thing that my impression is that an awful lot of what gets taught in computer science, in colleges, not all, but a lot, is kind of how to program, which is, it's kind of a trade. It's kind of a, it's a trade like carpentry, like lots of other things. It's a pretty rich and complicated trade, but it's basically a thing where you learn it by doing it. And you can do that by doing it in a class, or you can write pieces of code for yourself, or you can, work at a company and gradually get better and better at writing things. And it's not clear. I mean, I don't know. It's like you mentioned stand-up comedy. I'm curious whether being a good stand-up comic is something that is actually, if you take somebody who didn't have sort of any intrinsic talent in this area, and you run them through these courses, you run them through enough courses, what do you get at the end of it, so to speak? I'm skeptical. I think it's one of these things where you're either going to have sort of the spark that makes that really be a thing that you're going to be into. Maybe it takes you a while to discover how to use that spark. I mean, this is a thing when people do, I don't know, lots of kinds of things, but something like management or entrepreneurism. There are many, many, many different ways to do it that's suitable for many different personalities. And you can be like, I need to be this kind of entrepreneur, this kind of manager. And sorry, it's just not your personality and it's not going to work very well. But if you can figure out, I can run this kind of company or whatever, and you figure out what that is, then it takes off and it's wonderful. And I think the same is true with a bunch of them. I mean, look, it's true with these, I think these things where somebody says, I really don't get computers, but I'm going to study computer science. And eventually after 4 years, I'm going to, be able to write Java code or whatever. I don't think that's going to end that well. I don't think it'll be a fulfilling result. And it's better to find something you actually really like to do. And sometimes the problem is that what you learn about in school is a small fraction of what's out there in the world. And, you don't, you go, good exercise, look at an encyclopedia or something and say, pick a random article. Is this something they teach in school? The answer is maybe 20% of the time, maybe a little bit more than that. But there's an awful lot of stuff that happens in the world that is not what you get taught in school. And sometimes also confusing, like the things you get taught in school, like math or something, the low-level versions of what you learn there are really different from if you're going to be a math researcher or something. It really isn't much like doing arithmetic problems. And sometimes people, like in math, for example, they'll say, I really like math in school. What do you like about it? Do you like problem solving? Do you like sort of definitive competition? Do you like having a subject where there's a right answer? Do you like something about kind of the formal elegance of the whole thing? If you can kind of figure out which of those pieces, then there are all kinds of different, directions based on those pieces. But just knowing, it's like, I'm doing math, I want to go on doing math or whatever, it doesn't even stay the same thing because, what it turns into in terms of research is very different. I mean, the thing to realize is the people who succeed in doing research at a sort of high level, the number one attribute is sort of the strategy of what you study. It is not the mechanics of how you study it. There are many people who can get through the mechanics of how to study it. The question is, more what question are you going to ask than can you answer the question that has been asked, so to speak, which is really different from what happens in school where you're fed questions that you didn't make up.
Right.
And, so that's right. No, I think, anyway, yes.
Right. So it's important to stumble upon the problem rather than someone feeding you the problem. And then, because I think I agree with you, it's much better to find something that you want to work on rather than someone telling you, okay, write this piece of code or write this program which does this for me. Because if it's something that you actually come up with, you will be more inclined to learn more about it and everything around it too. That's an idea we have been talking about for a while now, which is project-based learning. We were thinking how can we ask important questions and how can we change the institutions that exist today, what needs to change so that the people who are a part of this institution can think more broadly, more deeply about the world that they're living in, right?
Right.
And what we thought was common denominator in all of this was that if you come in, or if you have the right atmosphere, we can explore and find a project that you want to work on, and if you're given the resources to work on it, like this university, for example, right? We have so many wonderful, like brilliant people on the same campus in such close proximity. But like you mentioned, students, once you're in a university, you don't really interact with these professors. There's like a sort of disconnect. You learn from them, sure, in classes, but there's nothing beyond that.
Just go knock on their door.
Right.
It's a good strategy.
Exactly.
Maybe I'll get complaint emails from people saying, you sent all these students to... No, but professors, at least when I was in that business, even though I really wasn't that interested in being a professor, it was interesting when I would talk to students. And one of the things that often surprised me, I was a professor for a little while at the University of Illinois, and one of the things that occasionally students would come and see me, and the first thing I would ask them is, so what are you interested in? So we'd have a discussion about that. Mm. And they'd say, that was a very useful discussion. Nobody ever asked me that before. It's I think that was but no, to your point about what you study, and there are people like me, for example, who are very motivated by things that they, by questions that they're interested in answering. Right. There are other people for whom that's a less important thing. Mm. And I think the other thing that I've noticed is, sometimes I am confronted with things which, frankly, at the beginning seem really tedious and boring. And, they're engineering problems that we have to solve or whatever else. And it's like, this is going to be really dull. And I get into it. And what I've discovered is that if you do basically almost any problem in an intellectual sort of deep way, it will turn out to be interesting. Hmm. And, there is a way to do it that will be quite boring, where you're just sort of skating across it to try and get to the other side. Maybe you'll succeed in getting to the other side. Maybe you won't. Maybe you'll fall into the ice or whatever. If you choose to think about these things, you choose to say, what's the real problem? What is the intellectual underpinning of what's going on? Let me really think about that. Even things which at the beginning were like, it sounds really pretty dull, turn out to be quite interesting. Mm. And I'm sure that's true. Now, a lot of students get into the situation where they're so busy. It's like, I've got to, write in this paper, do this, whatever it is, that they can never do more than skate. Right. Because they have so much to do. And I think that's an unfortunate feature of, I don't know how much that's true in the college experience at University of Illinois, for example. Certainly in the sort of elite high school experience, that does seem to be a terrible problem, that people are just like they can't really do anything for more than 5 minutes, so to speak, because it's just there's so much to do. But yes, I think, look, this whole thing about people actually thinking is an interesting issue, and it's something where for a lot of education ends up getting very industrial and ends up being, can you do this process, do this thing, do this thing, do this thing. There isn't really much thinking involved. I remember when I was a professor at University of Illinois, briefly, I ended up, was the last class I ever taught, was about physics for non-scientists, okay? And I thought this would be kind of fun because you get to talk about all kinds of sort of conceptual things, and there were a bunch of students in the class. And it turned out some sort of local folks from around town started showing up and being in the back. So that was a sign that at least somebody was finding it interesting. I remember that the first question on the first homework for that class was estimate the number of ears of corn in a typical cornfield. Okay, and this produced kind of almost a riot for the students. They're like, how are we supposed to do this? It's like, do you know how to multiply? Do you know, you've seen cornfields. There are lots of them around here. Do you look at the corn plants? How far apart are they? You can figure this out. It just requires thinking, and it doesn't require any kind of thinking that is beyond what, college sophomores or whatever they were, should be capable of. It doesn't require fancy, knowledge of physics or anything like that. It's kind of common sense thinking that, and it was interesting that people, it was kind of shocking to me how, and this is now 1986 or something, so a while ago. It was a little bit shocking to me how much people were like, we're not supposed to think. We're just supposed to be fed, these are the ingredients, now run it through the machine and get out the result. So yes, I think that, this challenge of how do you encourage people to think? First step is to let them know that it's sort of okay to actually think.
Right.
Which is not always the case that people communicate that, because a lot of classes, it's kind of like you're putting 2 and 2 together, you're getting 4, that's all we do in this class. And, if you think more broadly, if you write an essay that is not what the teacher thought it was going to be, you'll get a bad grade.
Right. You get penalized for doing something that's not what you're supposed to do.
Right. Well, right. And I think that is, so, how does one avoid that? Well, the thing that I think is a bit odd sometimes is that, I have many, many friends who are professors, and they, at least people, my friends are usually, they're interested in things which aren't the I already knew that type thing. It's like, many years ago, I had a friend, a well-known physicist named Dick Feynman, who had the following principle about graduate students, okay? Said if somebody came to, wanted to work with him, and they wanted to work with him on some project that he knew absolutely nothing about, then he would do it. But as soon as it was something that he was kind of like, oh, I already know about this, and so on, he wasn't interested. Now, he did pass on to me various kinds of tidbits of, he was not that enthusiastic about that. I think one of his tidbits was, a thesis is a project done by the advisor under adverse conditions, by which he meant that, I think bad management on his part, but anyway, the student would come in, would talk about some problem, the advisor would say, oh, you should do this and this and this. Student would go away for 2 or 3 weeks, come back, the advisor has now forgotten what they figured out, and the student has come back and hasn't made progress. Now, honestly, to me, having managed people and projects for a long time, that's not what should happen. If you do it correctly and you give the right input to somebody, they should be able to come back 2 weeks later and have actually achieved something. If you give them a bunch of input which they don't understand, then that's not going to work. But it's part of the responsibility of the teacher or whatever or manager to sort of do things which are going to be possible for that person. I mean, one of the general problems of management, which I suppose I've spent more of my life doing than professoring, is you have to figure out, you've got these people, you've got these projects, and the people have certain capabilities, the projects have certain needs. How do you fit these together? If you try and sort of force fit it and just say, okay, this person, just do this project, even though it's completely the wrong project for you, it's not going to work. And so, that's the responsibility there. And I think in terms of professors and so on, if they can figure out, enough about what's going on with the student to be able to say, hey, this is a good project, then they can really help. And, I don't know, we've been doing this summer school for college students, graduate students, and so on for the last, how long is it? 20 years now. This is my, now that I'm not a professor, this is my moment each year of sort of extreme professoring, because it's a 3-week thing, and I get to basically make up projects for 75 people or something. And it's an interesting process, because I gradually over the years have gotten a little bit better at doing it. It's really satisfying when you make up a project and you discover that the person turned that into a whole sort of career starter, and sometimes even almost career. And that was, it's like, okay, that was a good, that was worthwhile.
Right.
And I think, but this problem of how do you match a project to the student is an interesting problem. And people, as I say, we learned more over the years how to do that. I mean, what tends to happen sometimes in colleges, graduate school, things like that, is an advisor will have some definite research program, and it's like, okay, you plug in here, which can be okay, particularly if you as the student pick that advisor well and pick a project where you're like, I'm going to fit into this part and I really care about this project, then that's a thing that can work well. it can also end up that, in some areas like life sciences, one where this happens a lot, you're just pipetting things, and you're part of some big machine, and you don't really have a lot of sort of self-determination about what's going on. I think the other challenge is, for the student's point of view, you can say to some professor, I want to study this, and that professor is the person who's supposed to be teaching you whatever. Problem is, the professor doesn't know about that, or they don't care about it. And so, again, you have the flip side of the problem. The professor feeds the student something the student isn't very suitable for them, is the student can end up, asking the professor to do something that is just not in the wheelhouse of that particular professor. And so that's, again, the more you can study what a professor, knows about and cares about, and the more you can show up, when you knock on the door and ask a question that is really, something that that professor is going to find interesting, because you study what they're doing, and so you can say, well, there's this thing, what about that? But this whole point about, how do you teach people to think, it's a fascinating problem. It has not helped the larger and sort of more industrial educational institutions get, the more difficult it is to make that happen. Because if you've got, 1,000 students you've got to get through this program, it's much more challenging to say, and each one is going to do some personalized thing. That's, it's not really a thing that is easy to achieve. And I think, so, again, it becomes partly doing projects that you're excited about is a way that you will think about things that you kind of care about. Sometimes you may get stuck, and then you have to try and figure out, is there a person you can go talk to get unstuck, who won't just tell you that's a stupid project, or won't give you a bunch of stuff where you say, I don't understand any of that, and then you just get sort of dispirited and say, I can't possibly do this project. That's another challenge. But I think it's one of these things where there's both things that could be done sort of on the professoring side, and there's things students can do to make kind of them have a better experience in this, given what the machine is, the student can sort of figure out more about that machine to optimize their experience in it.
And I think that ability to, I think a lot about this question of why are people in that way? And a term I kind of use, it's NPC, which stands for non-player character, which is from a video game, which is this thing. It's kind of a funny way to think about this problem, which is people do not seem to be thinking for themselves, and they're just kind of mob mentality type of thing. And how I think about it is that perhaps if you start doing these type of projects more in public and sharing it and inviting people to work with you, you can actually kind of show them that it's okay to do these type of things, and it is possible.
Yeah, look, one of the things I've often done, like at our summer school, we usually start off with, I do some live computer experiment, okay? One feature of live computer experiments is, I've been doing them for years, I'm pretty good at them, but you're going to discover something, you're going to work on something you've never seen before. So things are going to go wrong. And, usually my observation is at about the 2/3 point, it looks like all is lost, and, typically, and we're not going to be able to figure out anything. What's interesting about that process is you get to see both, the fact that, somebody like me who's been doing this stuff a long time, it's still not, you don't just do it, and it all just works. It's like things go wrong. It's point one. Point two is the thing you thought you were going for at the beginning. Another thing that maybe is a useful thing to emphasize there is that at the beginning, one sets a strategy. We're trying to do this, and here's why it's interesting. Then you get into it. Then you realize, gosh, the thing we were trying to do, either you realize there's this other thing over here that we just discovered that's actually more interesting than the thing we thought we were going to look at. So, we should kind of, pivot what we're doing to look at that instead. And that's the idea that, you're kind of locked in, I meant to do this. Somebody told me to do this. And, even though something more interesting showed up here, we can't go chase that. But anyway, I think that's an example of something that, doing that kind of thing. I don't think that many professors, for example, I don't know anybody who does that. I mean, I think it's a totally scary thing to do if you are not fairly confident and don't really care if the whole thing, blows up, so to speak. I mean, I do a lot of live streaming of a couple of different kinds. I mean, one is several different kinds actually, but one of them is, software design stuff where it's just like the actual raw, these are our working meetings. We're going to live stream them. Why not? They're interesting. We get good feedback in real time, which is helpful. And sometimes people will suggest things that are useful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's, it's a thing where that is a place where you can see, hundreds of hours now, probably 500 hours, maybe more, maybe 1,000 hours, I can't remember, but of actual, figuring stuff out. And you can see the results because they're things that wind up in Wolfram Language, in the next version of Wolfram Language, this function that you can see there are 4 hours of discussion about this thing, and then this is how it got resolved. And that's a place where, there's definitely thinking is visible, so to speak. I mean, this is a thing that happens in the concept that thinking should be done invisibly is a strange concept. But, most university teaching, that's how it works. Because the professor will present something. It's not like they're figuring something out in real time. It's just like, let me tell you about this thing. And I think that's, another live stream thing that I've been doing is sort of live stream Q&As about science, about history, about other things. It's very educational for me. I hope it's educational for the people who watch it, but it's educational for me because it causes me to think about things that, if somebody asks me some question about something, usually the questions where I say, that's a physics question, I know the answer cold. And then I get into actually answering it, and I realize, oh my gosh, there's this thing that I've known since I was, 10 years old, but it's not actually obvious, and you have to explain it. And, I'm not sure I can explain that easily. It takes me a bit of thought to see how to explain it. But, I think that there are these things where, that this problem. Okay, so a lot of people, a lot of educational settings, there's this is a process you go through to solve this type of problem. And, if you learn that process, you will get a good grade, and then you'll go on and be able to do all these other things. To me, that's fairly, in some sense, by the time it's that proceduralized, it will be automated in time. And the thing that's most interesting to do as a human is things that are more kind of judgment-oriented and more kind of involved with thinking. I mean, I think that, this question of how do you teach people to think? Interesting question. It is not the problem that is being solved by most of education. And the machinery of education is not particularly well set up for that because it's quite industrial with lots of people going through it and lots of kinds of assessment mechanisms and so on.
Very standardized in a way.
Right. But I mean, but then from the point of view of the student, it's kind of up to you to kind of learn to think, so to speak. I don't think there are situations that can be more helpful than less. I mean, I like to believe that some of the educational stuff we do with summer school, summer camp, some things that I do myself and so on are helpful in this regard, particularly so here's a point people don't realize, perhaps, a couple of points. I mean, one point is, you're given a question. Okay, if you know a bunch of stuff, you will be able to engage somehow to think about that question, even though there is, the answer is not in the back of the book. There isn't a book, but actually almost any question you can think about. And one of the things I've noticed, and it's true very much with people in sort of work setting, is do people keep the thinking apparatus engaged when they are presented with different kinds of things to do? People find that surprisingly difficult often. There are people who manage to do it, and that's great. And there are people where it's like, well, how does it fit into this class that I took? How does it fit into whatever? Well, actually, you really do know how to think more broadly, but for some reason, you disengage the thinking apparatus. So, for example, one place where one sees that quite a bit is, let's say academics going into business, okay, where they're pretty analytical and smart and they figure out lots of things, and then they're presented with some situation with people, business, organization, and so on, and the thinking apparatus disengages. It's like, look, you've got this problem, you know how to think analytically about things, you can figure it out. But it's like they don't understand that they can take the kind of the thinking that they know how to do in some technical field and apply the same underlying processes in some sense to something completely different. Another thing that I notice with students, okay, a pet peeve, right? So students will study this in class A, okay? Then you got sort of thing you're talking to them about, whatever. And it's like, you say, well, do you know anything about this? Well, yes, I took a class about this. Okay, well, so you can apply a bunch of the ideas from that field or whatever it is to this thing that's come up. Oh, they say, I didn't think of that. And often they really find it very difficult to take, even though they spent a year studying whatever it is, it's like, look, leverage what you learned there, relate it to what you now have to think about. This is it's a thing one can do, so to speak, but people find that really difficult. And even the transference from one class, I learned about this in this class. I mean, it's something, because people use Mathematica, Wolfram Alpha, Wolfram Language, and so on a bunch in courses in college, etc. One of the things that shocked me, okay, this is now 33 years ago, okay, first people were doing calculus with Mathematica back in the day. So I said, we're going to have this get together for the students who are in this very first class doing this. So I'm talking to these students. I say, what are you majoring? What are you doing? Civil engineering, whatever it is. So I'm like, oh, that's good because, you just learned all this methodology and all these computational tools that you can now use for civil engineering. Person looks at me completely blankly, like, really? Why? That doesn't compute, so to speak. That's a pity. And that's something where, figuring out how you take the thing you learned here and apply it there is very good exercise for people because, in a sense, these classes are very siloed. Like, Professor A is not going to say, did you learn this in Professor B's class? They're just doing, the thing that Professor A is supposed to be teaching typically. And sometimes there are sequences of classes. But, I think that's that's another feature. I think I had a different point I was going to make about sort of, another thing is this. So people think, I think, a lot of students think, knowledge just existed from the beginning of time. There was no moment when somebody invented that. I noticed this kind of interesting experience with Wolfram Alpha because it happens to, I put my name into the name of the product, so to speak. And so I'll meet students who use Wolfram Alpha all the time. They notice my name, and there's this kind of strange double take of where they're realizing that this thing, which is just a thing that they use that sort of existed for a while, that a person was actually behind this thing, so to speak. In other words, somebody had to create it.
Right.
And this is a thing people, I think, don't realize. And whether you're studying math or physics or whatever, and there's some named algorithm or something, or whatever, named, law, whatever it is, it's somebody had to invent that. Maybe it was the person who's named after, maybe it wasn't. That's the way it works in academic science. But, and then this idea that everything that is now and that you're being taught, somebody invented that stuff. And you could invent stuff too. It's not people don't get that as easily as you might think. And, I happen to have been interested in history quite a bit and in understanding why am I interested in history? I'm mostly interested in history because very interested in how ideas come to be the way they are now. So for example, I've just been studying, I think I mentioned thermodynamics, which is a field that's about the second law of thermodynamics. It's about 150 years old, okay? And I really didn't know in detail its history before the last few weeks. Its history is an incredible mess. Its history, there's some very great people who figured it out in the 1860s, and they kind of nailed it down by the 1870s or so. And turns out a bunch of things came to be believed within a few decades after that are simply not true. But if you trace through what happened historically, I now sort of understand how those things came to be believed. And it's interesting. And you kind of see that as first of all, one of the things is I sort of realized these things aren't true. And it's like, how can I be saying these things aren't true? People have believed this since 1870 or something. And it's like, I better go figure out why people ever came to believe this, because otherwise I don't know whether I know what I'm talking about. And if you trace it through, you realize people were having hypotheses about how things worked in gases and so on. But they didn't know gases were made of molecules. They didn't know molecules existed. And so they had a bunch of theory. And actually what happened is the theory that was done on the basis of sort of idealized fictional molecules worked pretty well. When molecules as a real thing were discovered, people said, so the whole theory must be right. So we proved the whole thing. But in fact, there was a different issue that happened there. But anyway, I think this thing about sort of everything has a way that it was discovered, and sometimes it's pretty interesting to learn how it was discovered. Another thing that happens is there'll be some field, there'll be some idea, and students will try and learn it, and they'll find it confusing. And teacher will say, no, this is this way. Look, it's in the textbook. This is how it works. Student will be confused. Turns out, if you look at the history, people were deeply confused sometimes for a long time, and it really is confusing. And what ended up in the textbook is some glossed version of what was really there. And if you understand that it was confused and sort of how people got confused, and sometimes it's really a good idea often to try and look at the original papers, books, whatever, about things. They are, I would say, about 2/3 of the time, they are clearer than anything that came later. 1/3 of the time, they can be impenetrable because the notation has changed. The way people were thinking about it was kind of crufty. It was, but a lot of this just happened to me. I was trying to understand something about thermodynamics, and I'm like, look, these textbooks are just absolutely opaque, and I don't think that what they're saying is right. So eventually, I go back to a little book called The Theory of Heat, written by a certain James Clerk Maxwell, who was the guy who did Maxwell's equations and so on.
So familiar, yeah.
Right. And so his book is really clear. And it's really clear that there are things, and he pretty much says it, that we don't know how this works. Actually, he has a very lovely thing at the very end. He has a very lovely description of lots of things. And then he's trying to explain, this is maybe late 1860s, 1870 or so. He's trying to explain why there are only a discrete number, it was early 1860s actually, why there are only a discrete set of different kinds of molecules, even though he doesn't know that molecules really exist. Okay? And so turns out Darwin's Origin of Species had been published in 1859. And so Maxwell has this chapter at the end of his book in which he says maybe the reason that there are discrete sets of molecules is for the same reason as there are discrete species in biology, and which is of course complete nonsense.
Right.
But it's interesting to see what
hypotheses they come up with.
Yeah, right, and what's obvious and what's not obvious, and that was at the time not known. Anyway, so we got down a bit of a rabbit hole there of
no, but that's a good thing. Like you mentioned, like even during the Q&As, right? You realize that sometimes the kids would not know what you're talking about. Like what's obvious to you might not be obvious to them, right? And all of these theories, hypotheses that we learn about, they're all structured in a way that is intuitive to someone, eventually intuitive to someone reading it, right? We think we fully know how, like we understand how this is working, but in reality, it's still an hypothesis. It's still based on our observations of that particular system, right? But what if there are things that do not have an intuitive understanding? Like you mentioned in one of your TED Talks that the reason that you came up with a new kind of science is because we're trying to describe everything with these human constructs, which is like exponentials, integrals, and everything, right? And what if there are things that we're trying to find answers for, but we don't have these systems ready to explain any of that? Like what if there are things that are unintuitive to our understanding and things that we cannot comprehend.
Well, so what happens, this is the story of the advance of sort of paradigms in science and other places. That's what happens, is people don't have an intuition, they don't have a framework, they don't have an understanding. At some moment, for whatever reason, the pieces assemble and that paradigm emerges. And then there is an understanding. I mean, it's even often, the words didn't exist to describe that thing. And then one sort of sees how it fits together, and then one builds this paradigm, and then one's off and running. And yeah, without that paradigm, I literally was just looking at this in connection with the thermodynamics thing. So when I was like 13 years old, I tried to write this program to do some simulation of gas molecules, okay? And it didn't work. And I only just realized 2 days ago why it didn't work, okay? And the reason it didn't work was because of things that I discovered in the 1980s about the way that simple programs behave and so on. But those things were so far away from what my intuition or understanding was when I was 13 years old or whatever, and couldn't get there from here. And for example, in the physics project that I've been doing the last 3 years or so, which has been going really spectacularly well, I realize that project, which is sort of, I think, our 100-year shot at actually understanding how a bunch of physics actually works. But to get to the point of being able to do that project, there wasn't really a straight line way to get there. It required different paradigmatic understanding from things about computation, things, actually doing experiments, things like this. And it's something where, you can't get to that point. It is not easy to get to that point. If you are, the student who is trying to solve this problem and it requires some new paradigm, then, you will not get to that point. That's, now I have to say, the meta paradigm of our times is computation. And there are just a huge number of things where it's just do a computer experiment. Now, the technology stack I've been building for such a long time is the thing that I hope enables that for people across lots of fields. If you're down in the details writing the piece of Python code to do this or that or the other, you won't get there.
Right.
It's just you'll be submerged in this kind of swamp, and you have, if you're operating at sort of a higher level where you're really trying to think about things in computational terms, and my attempt is to make a language that gives people the primitives to sort of think in computational terms, then it's a really pretty good meta approach to pretty much any field at this point. And it's one of these things where, I don't know, it's got a run of at least a bunch of decades where there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit that is completely unpicked in all of these different areas. And so, for me, it's like if one is, can one invent a paradigm for something? Can one understand what's going on? Try and make it computational. If you can do it, you have this big kind of, this big accelerator, because actually it's sort of a unique thing, because it's something that has not historically happened, which is you get that automated computational collaborator, so to speak. That's never been possible before. There's never been a place where once you can explain something in these terms, it is not just a question of a human having to go do this, 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 and this. It's like, then I just put it in and something automatically, accelerates forward, so to speak. So it's maybe I hadn't thought about it this way actually, but I mean, maybe this is, people are always convinced that history, the things that are happening now are different from the things that have ever happened before in history. But I think in that sense, the kind of computationalization of things is a different thing that has happened in the development of paradigms before, because it's a paradigm where you get sort of the automated assistant along with the paradigm, so to speak, in addition to just having a way to think about things. But yeah, I think that the this question of, a good example I've been working on a bunch is quantum mechanics, where actually the aforementioned physicist Dick Feynman always used to say, nobody understands quantum mechanics. And he'd worked on quantum mechanics his whole life, okay? And he would say, nobody understands quantum mechanics. And I think he was right at the time. And, I've been excited that at this moment, we seem to be getting to the point where I'm almost to the point where I say, I think I really actually understand quantum mechanics.
Really?
And it's a, sort of a soundbite of how things work. is you might think, in classical physics, sort of definite things happen in the world. Throw a ball, goes in a definite trajectory. In quantum mechanics, sort of the big idea is there are many different trajectories that you can follow, and you're only looking at probabilities of different things happening. But the question is, sort of how does that really work underneath? And what we've kind of realized is that the sort of the history of the universe branches and merges all the time. So instead of there being a single sort of thread of time in the universe, there's this giant branching, merging graph of threads of time. So then the question is, well, why is it that we think that definite things happen? Because if there are all these branching, merging pieces, why do we think definite things happen? Well, then we realize, well, we're part of this whole branching, merging universe. So our brains, our minds are also doing this branching, merging thing. So quantum mechanics ends up being the story of how does a branching brain perceive a branching universe,
Right.
which is at some level, you kind of realize even from that description that it's going to be a little bit difficult to see what happens. But once you realize that that is what is happening, you kind of have at least a fighting chance of being able to see how it all works. And we're getting closer. And it's very, it requires some different ideas than people have seen before. But it's something where, in the end, it's not mysterious. And in the end, all those places where, you had to make this jump, you had to sort of suspend disbelief, so to speak, and, to understand the textbook. I don't think you'll have to do that in future. I think it's going to be something where you can just say, well, it's this way, this way, this way. It requires paradigmatic ideas that people like ideas about how computation works and this notion of computational irreducibility, about how you sort of can't know the outcome of a computational process more efficiently than by following the steps and so on. It requires really having some intuitive understanding of those things. And that's something that, slowly comes. But, given that, I think there will be sort of a direct, it won't be a mystery thing where you just have to say, the formulas work this way, trust me, it's going to work out type thing. So, but I think that in terms of, what students do and don't understand from textbooks, the project I happen to be doing these few weeks could be classified as a thing a student didn't understand in a textbook 50 years ago. Because I got this particular book about statistical physics 50 years ago. And I thought it was pretty interesting, but I really didn't understand how it came to the conclusions it came to. And so my plan, long time ago, was I would make a computer simulation. The book actually had computer simulations in it to understand how it worked. I didn't manage to do it because in the end, I didn't know a bunch of things that are from a paradigm from the future, so to speak. And that was, but that was in a sense, for 50 years, I've been sort of picking away off and on at this thing that was a thing I didn't understand in a textbook 50 years ago. And I would say that for the things you don't understand in a textbook now, you can go ask a professor, see whether they have anything sensible to say. They may not have anything sensible to say. Another thing to realize about fields and things is that usually a field gets invented, this methodological advance happens, there's a bunch of people involved, they're kind of intellectually entrepreneurial, they build the field. Then people work in that field for many academic generations. By generation number 5 or something, nobody thinks about the foundations anymore. If you talk to the people who built the field originally and you say, hey, why does it work that way? Why does it work? Say, well, we think it works that way. I'm not absolutely sure. It might be a different way. You go to the sort of 5th academic generation, it's kind of, well, of course it works that way. It's always worked that way. It's in the textbooks that way.
Right.
There's no possibility of something different. So one of the things that I've found is kind of a little bit of a trick for doing research in a sense is often if you go back to the foundations, there's a lot of stuff there that is still kind of exposed and unresolved. And if you're 50 years later, for example, the methods that now exist from other places will often allow you to, make progress on those foundations in a way that absolutely wasn't possible when they were first laid down. And so the people in those fields will be like, you can't work on those foundations. They were laid down 50 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. And it's like, and so it's a little shocking at some level, but it's also actually it's often easier to do that than to go all the way up the tower of all the stuff that's been built in the last 100 years, understand all of that, and then try and add a little piece at the top. That's a more difficult thing to do sometimes. And if you can make a foundational change, the whole tower gets shifted. Of course, people may be very resistant to shifting the tower, but that's a different issue. But there's certainly, in terms of personal satisfaction of what one does, it can be pretty nice. I mean, I think, it really helps in a lot of these things, the thinking, research, whatever, having some confidence that the things, that you might just be able to figure it out is important. And I don't know, different people get that confidence in different ways. And some people, unfortunately, never get that confidence that they can just dig in and figure stuff out. But I think that's a valuable thing to try to achieve, so to speak. And I think, I don't know whether people who, do the exercises, they do great in the exercise. I think some people come away from that with the confidence that they can figure things out. And other people come away from that having been sort of trained to only run in this track. And if somebody shows them something off that track, they freak out. So I think it sort of goes both ways there.
That is such an interesting idea that you mentioned, that how you explain quantum mechanics in the sense of a bunch of threads, and that we see fields and ideas as a single threaded thing, that how it could be. So over the last couple of months, I've been obsessed about flying things, and the way how I've been teaching myself everything is through writing. And one thing I've realized is that I'm always inclined to learn about the history and just teach myself everything about the history, because like you said, is that we went on to put it in a more GitHub way, it's you create a branch and we go all the way from there, and we never merge to other branches that could have happened. So when you go back to the history, then you can see all the branches, all the different possibilities that you could have picked and see. And I think that only by learning the history, going back to the fundamentals, reading, Darwin or reading, all this, or the original sources, how you can create possible this new branches that you can actually merge through different ways.
Right. What was the subject you said? Flying?
Yeah, so I
planes or drones.
Yeah, so my idea is that I don't want to ever walk on campus or take the bike or anything, and I want to create a personal flying vehicle. Stupid, maybe not. Who cares? But
I've seen some demos of such things.
So I was like, okay, I want to teach myself everything about it and build some drones and things like that. Anyway, so that's an example of how I have a similarity of the history is such an interesting thing that it can allow you.
Yeah, well, I mean, drones are a great example of why were drones not built in gas-powered drones built in the 1940s or something? Well, the answer is because the control systems were too hard. And it took flight control, microprocessor-based flight controllers to be able to actually make the thing stable, because a human controlling it couldn't make it stable. It was something computers do better than we do. But I think, I mean, it's an interesting case where there probably is, I don't know. I was, the Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone, right? One of his obsessions in later life was kites and flying things. And so there's these wonderful pictures, I just happened to run across them recently, of these tetrahedral kite structures that he built, which are actually fractal-like things. And I don't think anybody's looked at those again. I mean, it's a kite structure that is some kind of truss that has some good weight to area ratio, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Who knows? Maybe that's the thing that should be, delivering cell phone service or something from flying, high altitude flying things. Who would know? It is the case that, in engineering, for example, it's pretty common that an idea exists and it was 50, 100 years ahead of its time. And it could not be executed in the way that it was conceptualized at the time when it was first developed. I mean, the fax machine, now past history, but that had a 100-year predecessor. Just wasn't possible until there was microelectronics and so on. And I think, it is interesting to there's probably, people talk about, understanding engineering from biology, but there's also understanding engineering from engineering history, so to speak. Interesting. I was talking of flying, In around maybe 1900 or so, Lord Kelvin of the temperature scale fame famously said, "Heavier than air flight is impossible," okay? Which has been quoted as a goofy thing for him to say. I realized a few weeks ago what his conceptual framework for saying that was, which was he worked on the second law of thermodynamics. And one of the statements of the second law of thermodynamics is perpetual motion machine is impossible.
Right.
That will take heat and make mechanical work out of it. Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure, and I need to go look at what he actually wrote, I'm pretty sure that his heavier than air flight is impossible, he thought that was a statement just like the second law of thermodynamics, that it was a statement that you couldn't, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly, I have to read what he actually wrote, but it's sort of interesting to me that statement, which on its face just seems kind of silly, is actually probably had for him a not completely foolish kind of, precursor in something that people still believe, which is it's impossible to make a perpetual motion machine of the second kind that just, from heat generates mechanical work. So interesting. No, I think it would be, in fact, I wonder whether he actually imagined that, actually, this is, now that I think about it, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm going to find this out. But, birds fly. Life didn't follow what they thought of as being second law behavior back then. The fact that birds can fly and birds are alive might have meant that he thought that there was sort of a special exception for what would usually be true for things that were alive, which he thought there was for thermodynamics. I mean, confusingly enough, back in those days, there was this term vis viva, which is Latin for life force. That was what actually turned into kinetic energy. So that was what the name for kinetic energy was before it was called kinetic energy.
Right. So
that, of course, created another whole raft of confusion. When people did start in the late Victorian period there, people were talking about life forces and so on in connection with all kinds of spiritual, this, that, and the other stuff. And so that was another kind of entangled confusion. But now that I think about it, I bet Kelvin made that mistake because he thought that birds were a special case because they were alive. That's okay. That's a homework exercise for me to find out if that was true. But interesting.
And all of that came due to the that confusion, perhaps came of a language issue, which philosophy would never be complete because of language. And something related to that I'm curious to hear what you would think is that like Marshall McLuhan said once, we shape our tools and the tool shape us back. How do you, so in your life could be described as you created your own tools so you can augment your intellect, which is kind of similar to Engelbert had envisioned. When you look back 50 years back, you created all these tools. How do you think these tools have
No, they define how I think about stuff. If it wasn't for these, if it wasn't for Wolfram Language, I would not be able to think about things computationally in the way that I can. And the physics project, for example, would not exist. Lots of things would be different. I mean, this is the way that tools, language. These are the ways that one sort of concentrates thoughts so that one can build on them. I mean, that is the people. With human languages, people sort of wonder. Does it matter what human language you speak, how you think about things? It probably does a little bit, but it's not a dramatic effect. With, in the world of computational language, it's a dramatic effect. Like you can see people, who can think using, Wolfram Language or whatever. You can think about how to set things up, and you think, how do I make this computational? This is a way of concretifying those thoughts, which I don't think would be easy to do without that. I don't think you would be able to, I don't think you would conceptualize those kinds of things. Just as it's pretty hard to think about things for which there are no words in a human language. And it's, yes, so the answer is, I think that, the tool building is absolutely critical to, things I've done. And, there's been this sort of spiral of do basic science, use that to build tools and technology, use the technology and tools to do basic science. I've sort of executed about 5 loops around the spiral, so to speak. And that's, another thing to comment on in the world of sort of studenting and things like that is it is shocking how much people don't use the tools they can use. It's just like when I started, doing physics and things, I started using computers to do sort of algebraic calculations and so on. And, there were experimental systems for doing this. It was not undoable, but nobody else did this. And it was just like, why is nobody else doing this? This is not that hard. And it's you had to know a little bit about computers and things. And, your average physicist might not have known that, but physicists tend to be an agile lot and they can learn all kinds of things. But it was sort of shocking to me, and it is today. I mean, in our sort of computational language stack, there are plenty of people who use it. There are plenty of people who are sort of leaders in their fields who use it. And there are lots of people who aren't leaders in their fields often, who are like, oh, no, I don't use that. I don't need to use that. I'm just doing this, and I don't really need that. It's like, why are you doing this? You just tied both hands behind your back. You're not, it will be really difficult for you to achieve things that way. But for some reason, people, I think, I don't know what it is. It's a sort of strange trait of, I'm not going to actually learn tools. Maybe it's the same thing as people who do a class about something and then are completely unable to apply that class. And so it's kind of like, this tool is for the purpose of being applied. And somehow, unless I just do a class to learn this tool and then I'm just going to do that in that class and that's the end of it and I can't apply it. And maybe it's the same phenomenon, I don't know. But, it's certainly something, I see in I somewhat, I quite often describe technology we built as kind of artifacts from the future, in the sense that it's things that, if you ask people, could this be done? It's like, is this in principle? I'll say, yes, it's in principle possible. Well, actually, we've done that, and it's like, but that really seemed like it was something that should happen only in the distant future, so to speak. And it's one of the things I kind of like it, where this week is our annual technology conference, so a bunch of our sort of leading users and so on show up, and it's the first one in person in a couple of years. So we'll see who actually comes. But I think the thing that's interesting there, I see these people who have sort of grabbed this artifact from the future, brought it into the current time in their field, whatever it is, and it's like they got the extraterrestrial technology boost, so to speak. They're able to do things that other people in their field can't do, and they're like, oh wow, you can do this, and it's like, look, they're just using this artifact from the future, so to speak, that we happen to have built now, and I think it's cool to see that, because it's something where people can just do things that seemed like they would be, that may seem to other people in those fields that were impossible. And I'm sort of shocked to that, because I've been looking at some personal history of mine to do with thermodynamics and so on. I'm reminded again of this craziness that, I've done this many times, of just taking tools from somewhere, using them in something, and it's like, why did nobody else do this? This is not hard. This is not, it doesn't require a great cognitive leap to see that this is possible, but people just don't do it, and I don't really know why. And that's but yes, the certainly for me, I have built tools that are sort of machinery for making things that I want to do be possible. And then in the end, there are so many things, as this tower has gotten built, there are many things. There's no way I could have seen, from the bottom of the building process, there's no way I could have seen what I can now see from where we are in the tower. Now, in terms of building machinery and tools, for me personally, I built a bunch of technology. I've also built company, and company is in a sense a different kind of tool, a different kind of machine for going from ideas one has to real things in the world. And it's a different, it's not something where it's a transferable, anybody can just get this, can download this bag of bits and run it themselves type thing. It's a different kind of thing, but it is the same, perhaps the same instinct for me of, you build a tool that allows you to do things, and sometimes that's a technological tool, sometimes that's an organizational tool.
Do you consider the new kind of science to be that hole in the history that you were mentioning? That, like you mentioned, like even when we look back at something that we have been learning for like 50 years, right? We still find like some flaws or some holes in the history, like things that they didn't figure out, but they just got accepted as time passed, and that people just started considering them to be true. And anytime you try to mess with that, people are resistant, and the tower will resist basically, right? Like inertia. So do you think, is that why the new kind of science is facing this kind of resistance?
I don't think it faces any resistance anymore.
Okay.
I mean, I think it won. Because, if you look back 25 years and you look at, when people were making models of things, how did they make those models? They wrote down equations. If you look today at new models people are making of things, they usually make programs. That was the point of new kind of science. Right. And, it won. Now, it's a somewhat silent, it's not something where it's a sort of trumpet blaring thing. But if you actually look at the actual practice of science and so on, that approach won. I think it's interesting when the book first came out, in many areas, people were like, "Oh, great, new methodology for doing stuff. We're excited." Off they went. They did things, and I think it's an important seed for what has become this kind of program-based way of doing science. The one community that I realized sort of long after the fact was the one that was hostile to the whole enterprise, was the physics community, which was very weird because that was a community that, among other things, essentially all those people use our technology every day.
Right.
And those people had known me for some cases a long time. And what I realized is that this was sort of an alien invasion type situation where it's like, this is paradigmatically different. I remember one person, no longer alive, but a well-known mathematical physicist, who I'm talking to him about this, the book and so on. And he's very upset about the whole thing. And he's like, I looked through this book. I can't understand anything. It's a bunch of code and pictures. And, it's because he's a mathematical physicist who was used to, trading in equations, so to speak. And it's like, well, I said, well, that's the sound of a new paradigm, so to speak. It is different from what you know. And that's, now the thing that's been surprising with our physics project last few years is that what 20 years ago was a sort of a pitchfork, a big thing with lots of not lots of, a certain number of sort of physicists, this couldn't possibly be true type thing. That's actually melted away, and there's been essentially no pitchforkery, and which is interesting. I mean, I think it's happened because, first of all, fields go through different levels of self-esteem. And another one was pretty interesting, was when Wolfram Alpha came out in 2009, I wondered how the AI community would respond to it. Okay? Now, the AI community at the time was in deep winter. AI was it was almost dead. There was barely a sort of heartbeat there. And in fact, the people in that community were very positive. And I think it's kind of like, wow, something works, and the methodology of Wolfram Alpha is utterly different from the methodology that people had for sort of doing kind of brain-like AI type things. In a sense, one of the things I remember, was a big project had been done about common sense reasoning, where people had tried to sort of encode common sense reasoning in computational way, and then in a sense. And then Wolfram Alpha comes out, and many of the things that you sort of thought you might be able to do but couldn't really do with common sense reasoning, you could just ask the question to Wolfram Alpha, it'll give you the answer. Okay, so why did this work? What I realized after the fact is that the common sense reasoning approach used a period of intellectual history and science that predated the 1600s. That is, before the 1600s, it was all natural philosophy. There wasn't a mathematicization of the whole thing. So it was kind of if you want to figure out how this mechanical system will work, you imagine, you say, if you do this, then logically this happens and that happens and the other thing happens. Well, what we did was just cheat by saying you turn it into a bunch of equations, you solve the equations, and there's the result, which is what we learnt was possible in the 1600s in the mathematicization of science. And in a sense, the sort of the Wolfram Alpha story is in part a rerun of that cheating, because it's using computation to do a bunch of things that were not paradigmatically possible in other ways. But it was sort of interesting at the time that I would say that the AI community, such as it was pretty small actually, was very, very positive about it. And I think now with the physics project, perhaps physics has been in a slightly, there was 20 years ago, it was kind of like, we're going to solve it with string theory. String theory, it's just around the corner.
Right.
We're going to, and it's obvious that's not going to work that way. Although it turns out string theory is almost certainly a limiting case of the underlying kind of machine code that we kind of have built for physics. And although I'm still waiting for, a bunch of string theory people are sort of interested in this, but nobody's actually rolling up their sleeves and figuring out exactly how this correspondence works. But I think there will be one. But it's, so these fields go through periods where they're in more and less, we got it. We know how to do it. We don't need anything from the outside. And, I think that's so it's sort of a different time for that.
Is there anything you think you would have done differently back then when it first came out?
New kind of science? Well, the fact is, so one of the interesting, social media didn't exist.
Right.
Had they existed, people who were like, oh, we got this thing to say, and oh, no, it couldn't possibly be true. And, it's kind of a funny thing because you write a book that is basically based on computer experiments, okay? People say, it's wrong. So what do you mean it's wrong? You run the computer experiment, it does what it does.
Right.
That's not a concept. It's like, I think there was a certain amount of, I made a conscious decision not to kind of, when people were, by the way, I made a decade after the book came out, I made this kind of, analysis of sort of what responses to it have been. The fact is, the overwhelming answer was positive, excited responses. So, but somehow, in any negativism, there's a certain amplification in one's own perception,
right,
and so on. And so it's actually, but what I decided not to do at that time was kind of engage in the kind of the mud fight, so to speak. And it was very funny because, I went around the US, I gave like 25 talks at, main universities and things like that. And people were very polite. Nobody was kind of standing up and waving their hands and like, whatever. But yet, in a very cowardly way, people were like, oh, we control this, we can write this thing. It was funny because there was one guy, this is dead now, a chap called Steve Weinberg, who's a well-known physicist, who wrote this, was actually wrote this thing that was, I actually didn't read it because I sort of follow the principle of not reading stuff that's written about things I do because I don't think it's a useful feedback loop. He was like, oh, it's all nonsense type thing or something. I don't know exactly. But anyway, maybe a few months after it came out, I happened to have lunch with him. I arranged to have lunch with him. And I'm like, and it became clear that he just didn't understand it at all. And and he was like, oh, I didn't get that. It's like, what part of, again, it was one of these paradigmatic things. And by the way, interesting thing there is the name of the book was more sensible even than I had thought at the time. Actually, it was funny. I was doing a podcast with a physicist person, Lawrence Krauss. It's not the name can't be a secret because there's a podcast out there. Who was sort of I think was kind of like, oh, I can find find fault with this or that, but then he was talking about a new kind of science and so on, and was kind of trying to describe it and trying to characterize it and so on, and ends up basically saying, describing what it is, and ends up sort of falling backwards into saying a new kind of science. And I'm like, that's why I called the book that. It's not like the stuff that had gone before. That's why I called the book that, which was very important for many people in trying to read the book, because as soon as you prime people for the idea that an idea is a big idea, their response and their way of thinking about it is very different from the way that you say, oh, it's a small idea. The thing I've noticed is kind of interesting, even with stuff we're doing now. So I'll give a talk, some group. It'll have scientists, sort of regular scientists, it'll have some philosophers. Okay, here's the thing I found interesting. The scientists, even though they have a big advantage in terms of content, often have a harder time grasping a bunch of things that are going on. And why is that? The reason is, I think, I've noticed, that they don't understand that there can be more than incremental progress in intellectual things. That is, they're looking for, there's just this one step that goes from what I already know to what I need to know for this purpose. Whereas philosophers are much more used to the idea that there's many steps and it's complicated and you don't immediately understand what's going on. Mm-hmm. So it's a funny phenomenon. I mean, it may be totally biased by sampling, because it may be that the philosophers who show up to these things are philosophers who have sort of sophisticated thinking about science and things like this. So it might be a completely biased sample so far. So I can't necessarily say it will be generally true, but it's been a little bit notable to me that's how that's worked. But no, I think, had social media existed when NKS came out, I don't know. It might have been interesting to see how that dynamic would have been different. I think that the concept, as I say, of I can be a troll, so to speak, and write a review and nobody will sort of come back to me about it is something that I think has sort of evaporated in the world, and that so that sort of changed the. A lot of other crazy things have happened about sort of being able to get ideas out there, and kind of this, you can't get that idea out because it's has some ideological, political sort of bad resonance. That's a different thing. That's a different phenomenon, which fortunately, I think it's fair to say that the science and things that I've done has not really. It's been pretty independent of those kinds of issues. I mean, fortunately, it's funny how these things in science end up happening. I mean, like this idea of computational irreducibility that I first developed in the mid-1980s, I was like, it's an idea in theoretical science. Okay, so many years go by, and I think it's the idea that seeded the proof of work concept for Bitcoin. And so this idea, which I thought of as this theoretical idea, ends up being the seed for this thing that has, is for a while at least, burning the electrical output of, some medium-sized country and doing this crazy computationally irreducible computation, so to speak. So that's it's very unexpected what happens there. And, it is always a risk in doing basic science that the things you do end up getting entangled with sort of what end up being ideological, political types of things, sometimes ones that you're completely horrified by. I think I'm lucky so far, that hasn't happened with things I've done. The worst case is burning electrical output in proof of work, which is, a lot more benign than other kinds of things. But I think it is true that, for example, the idea of computational irreducibility, which is kind of this realization that even from within science, you discover that science has limitations on what it can say. That is something which the realization of the fact that that's the case, if that was a truly well-absorbed thing, people's attitude towards things like, can we predict this feature of a pandemic? Can we predict this thing about, global climate or something like this? Can we predict the result of this geoengineering thing? Can we not predict that, whatever it is? People, when you really internalize those ideas, you have a slightly different point of view about what, because we are in a period of time when sort of science can solve everything. Except that even from within science, science says science can't solve everything. So the big people haven't yet internalized that particular thing. I think it's actually not it is a, when it is internalized, I don't know, maybe it will go horribly wrong, but I think it is something that will be helpful in terms of things which are sort of ideologically, I don't know, in a sense, it puts humans a bit more back in the saddle, so to speak, relative to what, in some sense, there is an idea that science, it's like it all got solved with science. You don't need the humans figuring anything out. Turns out that's not true. And it's, you see that in the case of people, wondering, okay, we're building a bunch of AIs. What ethics should we give the AIs? Well, you say there's a scientific answer to that. Really? What is the scientific answer to what the AIs should be doing? And I think that's a case where in the end you realize, well, actually, it's a question of what we want the AIs to be doing. It's back to back over to us, so to speak, and that becomes a case where, and I think this is a general thing that you kind of learn from computational irreducibility and so on, that the humans need to be more in the loop. Without the humans, everything is generic, so to speak. In other words, what has become clear from our physics project with this concept of the Ruliad, which is a deep rabbit hole. I mean, the question is, if you believe that the universe is kind of a computational thing, there are these rules that are running, they're generating everything that includes, us sitting here yakking about stuff and so on. And then you say, well, why did the universe get these rules and not other rules? And then you start realizing, well, maybe actually the universe has all possible rules, but we are merely observing some slice of it, just like we are at a particular place in physical space, at this, some corner of some galaxy and so on. Similarly, we are at some corner of this kind of way that we are perceiving how the universe works and what rules it's using. So this sort of the ultimate object that emerges from this is this thing we call the Ruliad, which is the entangled limit of all possible computations. So imagine if you're sort of in the computer science, and I should have mentioned theoretical computer science when I was talking about computer science and kind of dissing it as an area, because theoretical computer science is great and it has lots of mileage. It's not what people mostly learn about when they and people who actually want to be production IT programmers or software engineers, knowing the theory of Turing machines is really not that relevant. It's a great field, however. But thought about in terms of those things, the Ruliad, one sort of instantiation of it would be you take all possible Turing machines with all possible rules, all possible inertial conditions, you run them. It's kind of an entangled thing because two different Turing machines can end up producing the same state. And so it's not the case that you just get all this definite threads of what can happen. So it's kind of that's the, so anyway, this Ruliad object, it's a very philosophically interesting object because it's kind of a necessary has to exist object because it is just a formal thing like 2 + 2 = 4. Once you've defined the terms, you have no choice about the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, so you have no choice about the fact that the Ruliad sort of is what it is, so to speak. And we're kind of, our experience is sort of based on these slices that we take of the Ruliad, and what we realize is that in a sense the Ruliad is the bland everything. It is, but our slice has all the stuff that is, our laws of physics, actually certain aspects of laws of physics are quite universal, but our kind of particular experience and perception of the world, so to speak. And what you realize, so here's one of the kind of shocking sort of philosophical, almost theological things to realize, is that in a sense the growth of knowledge is a growth of our extent in rulal space. That is, at some point we think the world works in this very specific way. Then we learn more about how to think about how things can work, and we're kind of extending this kind of domain in rulal space that we exist in. But now you say, well, what's the limit of that? What does the future hold? Well, we could imagine expanding our domain of understanding to the whole Ruliad. The problem is then there is no coherent us anymore. Because in a sense, the us, the thread of sort of, we are at this definite place in the Ruliad. We are who we are. We're localized in some sense in Rulial space, just as we're localized in physical space. All of that goes away by the time we sort of have colonized the whole of Rulial space. And so in a sense, it's a kind of be careful what you wish for, because in the end, and it has a certain resonance actually with some, I don't know enough about it, but with some things that people have concluded in sort of various kinds of sort of theological traditions and things like that. Once by the time you get to the point where you understand everything, you kind of, and sort of encompass everything, you no longer coherently exist. And so this is which is to say that the specialness of humans and the human history and all this kind of thing is something that is kind of, that's what makes it all make sense, so to speak. Without that, it is all generic. And that makes it, it's, and I think people kind of imagine that with science, we have something that just genericizes, it allows us to just figure out what to do in some purely theoretical, we can prove it's correct kind of way. And I think, computational irreducibility and a bunch of things that have come out of NKS, new kind of science, have, kind of show one, and it wasn't where I thought it was going at all, by the way. So that's a thing that's sort of interesting, because my personal, so this is sort of an interesting case. I mean, my personal ideology looked very inconsistent with the things that I was doing in science, even to me. I mean, that is, it seemed like I was successfully deconstructing everything and making it, sort of taking it to the point where everything that exists is kind of ground down into these computational elements that have no soul, so to speak, that have no kind of humanity to them.
Right, bare bones.
Yeah, right. But my personal ideology, I like people. I, run a company. I've been running a company for, it's 36 years, whatever it is. It involves people. I find people interesting. How is this consistent with a scientific, and for years I didn't really realize, and actually I was kind of clued in. I got to figure this out when somebody asked me in some interview, how can these two things be consistent? Somebody who actually knew me fairly well, who was interviewing me and was saying, I know that you are a sort of people-oriented person. How is this consistent with what you do in science, that you've ground it down into this kind of, these, and I then realized, actually, surprisingly, sort of by a circuitous route, the science actually turns out to very much sort of fulfill, in a sense, even though that, and this is one of the challenges in doing science, is to do it independent of one's own ideology about what should happen. And this is something I think people sometimes, and it gets even worse when there's sort of a whole political angle to the thing that comes in. But it's like, can you just do the science and figure out where the chips fall without, and I think somehow it's an important thing to have the confidence to be able to do that and to say, the chips may fall in the way that I think I ideologically want them to fall, or they may not. I'm just, going to do what I do, and I'm more interested in sort of having the science be coherent than I am in the fact that I happen to have sort of realized some particular personal ideological goal. But I think, I'm a little disappointed, and I've seen that a bunch in the time of the pandemic and other such things, that there's a certain tendency to sort of fall into these things where the science is in service of the ideology, so to speak, rather than you just do the science and you see where the chips fall, and you kind of might hope that it doesn't completely blow up your ideology, but it depends what you're in it for, so to speak.
Right.
But I've always found, I think one of the bigger achievements if you're doing science is to discover things that you didn't think were there, and that maybe at first you even don't think could possibly be true, and that maybe disagree with things that you sort of ideologically or sort of in your intuition about science thought were the case. All right, we've covered lots of things. Anything else you wanted to make sure to kind of hit?
So I had one thing that came up while you were talking is that we are observing the universe from our vantage point, right? We're only seeing a slice of the universe, and all of our laws that we're dictating are based on explaining that slice of the universe that we're seeing. Since we can never be fully isolated from the system, right? So, but we know there are other things that exist that we don't know of. So how do you deal with this concept of known unknowns? Like how can you begin to comprehend them? Or
So here's a thing that has come out of sort of the science that I've been doing, is you have this Ruliad, it has a structure, we can scientifically study that structure, but then the question is, what do observers like us observe in this Ruliad? So the question is, what do we need to know about us as observers to deduce that we will observe certain physical laws as we know, as we write them down in textbooks? And what we've discovered is that you actually don't need very many features of observers like us to get pretty detailed laws of physics. So, for example, the fact that we are computationally bounded. The universe is doing all these computationally irreducible things, but to fit it in our minds, it has to be computationally bounded. We can only analyze a slice that is sort of a computationally reducible slice of all the stuff that's frothing around going on underneath. So that's first feature. The other feature is that we believe we are persistent in time, which is kind of a weird thing because at every moment we're made from different atoms of space. So how could it be the case that, we all think, oh, we have a past, we have a memory of the past, it's still us, there's a thread of time, there's a thread of experience that is a single thread of experience. And we are persisting through time. So those two things turn out to be what you need to get general relativity and quantum mechanics, which is sort of two core theories, two core pillars of physics as it's known today. Now you ask yourself, well, if we were not observers like us, how would we perceive the universe? This is a really difficult thing to think about. And I've been interested, as we move outward in Rulial space, we are gradually being observers that weren't like the past of us, so to speak. That is, we are, an observer of today is different from an observer. For example, even this thing about using programs as ways to study what happens in the world. 25 years ago, people were like, they didn't have the idea of doing that, and that was an alien idea. No longer an alien idea. And so I think this question of sort of what is the perception of the universe from a point of view different from our own, I find this really interesting. I'm really, really curious about this. I've been trying to poke my science fiction author friends to kind of write about this, and some of them have written some things about it actually. But it's like, there are things, I think about it as sort of what's the distance in Rulial space between different entities. So, different human minds are a certain distance apart. They are, the way, like different machine learning systems will be they learnt things in a different way. And so they are perceiving the universe in a slightly different way. But we're able to communicate. It's not so far away in Rulial space. As you get people who have different sort of cultural background or whatever else, it gets more and more difficult to communicate. You're sort of further away in Rulial space. The concepts that we have are not ones that map as well into concepts that will have developed there. So then you go to, pets, for example. There's certain things you can communicate. The dog wags its tail. There's some emotional thing that we probably have in common with dogs that allows us to understand what's going on. But the full life, the full worldview of the dog, we don't have a good idea what the worldview of the dog is, or the whale, or whatever. And when you get further away than that, it's really difficult to know what is the worldview, of this, what's the worldview of this thing in the physical universe? What's the worldview of a computer even? I was actually trying to write something recently, I finally get it done, about what it's like to be a computer. It turns out it's pretty similar to being, it's funny because, you might think, well, you need to make a whole AI and do all this kind of thing before you can imagine what it's like to be a computer. But you realize that between when the computer is booted and when the computer crashes, it's pretty much like a human life. The computer accumulates a bunch of stuff in its memory. It, has certain experiences. Eventually the thing is restarted from sort of the same genetic material, so to speak. It's another cycle. It's before the operating system crashes or whatever, and during its life, it has many things that are surprisingly human-like in terms of sort of its internal perception of what's going on. And it's a case where we can more or less, we can sort of interesting because we have a hard time with human brains. We don't get to record from the 86 billion neurons or whatever people now say typical brains have, 100 billion neurons roughly. Similarly with computers, in principle, we might be able to record every single thing that's happening in the computer, but that's actually not in practice very easy to do. But it's still it's a thing where we, much more than with brains, we say we can point out what's going on inside there. For example, there's no free will to this computer. Mm-hmm. Look, we can see it's got these, transistors that are doing this and that and the other. Well, actually, we could do that with brains too. We just don't happen to have the technology to do it at this time. But anyway, this question of sort of what it's like to see the universe from an alien intelligence, very interesting question. I mean, it's a fun thing I wrote about a little while ago. Some people were pitching me a company that, then their concept of it then, it's now changed, thankfully, but their concept of it was, we're going to make a million tiny interstellar spacecraft. We're going to have them go out and discover extraterrestrial intelligence. We're going to bring back the technology from extraterrestrial intelligence to Earth, forget all those extraterrestrial patent rights and so on, and we're going to accelerate development of technology on Earth by a million years. Okay? So I was like, you cannot be serious. It's perfectly serious people, but you can't be serious. I mean, this is just a pure, it's an element for a script for the Silicon Valley TV show or something like this, because it's, but what's interesting is what's philosophically wrong with this idea. So, you kind of go off and you say, we're going to discover alien intelligence, and then we're going to bring back its technology. Well, alien intelligence, it's kind of like there's many computational things going on in the universe, which we can think of as alien intelligences. The weather has a mind of its own, whatever else. But now the question is, well, what's technology to the alien intelligence? What's technology to the weather? What's technology to us humans? Technology to us humans is we take stuff that exists in the world and we use it for things that we have purposes for. And so it's a thing where it's not that there is an abstract concept of technology. Technology is all tied up with kind of the human purposes that we're that we're following. And so this idea, what you realize is, in the end, the story of kind of go out and find alien intelligence and bring back its technology is actually just the generic story of science. What science is doing is taking sort of aspects of the universe and finding ways to turn them into things that we humans can relate to, and then we can use them for our purposes and so on. So it's kind of that's in a sense the communication with alien intelligence, abstract alien intelligence, is sort of what science is trying to do. Science is an attempt to find a language which allows humans to understand and create narrative about what's happening in the world. I mean, my main life work of building our computational language is sort of the same thing. It's trying to make a language that bridges between what we humans think about and what is computationally possible. And that's at any given time in history, the things which we humans are going to think about and care about will change a bit, even over the 36 years that I've been building Wolfram Language. It's longer than that if you include the precursor that I built in starting in 1979. It's 40-something years. It's been interesting because the ambient things that people understand have moved a bit. And so the things that it makes sense to put into a language that caters to humans, I mean, as I pointed out a few times when we do design reviews of some software engineering thing, our market is currently humans. And so things that involve, like we're doing, color, visualization or something, the mantis shrimp, which has a lot more color receptors than we do, would have a different, view of how we should do, color for visualizations. but our market is humans. And you sort of understand from that there's a certain, there's sort of humans at this time in history, so to speak, who have a certain set of, have a certain domain and rulal space. They have a certain sort of set of paradigms, and that's kind of that's what they deal with. But interesting question. I mean, to me, it's just a super interesting thing to try and think about what are really different ways to think about how things work. I mean, I was pondering to myself the following question a couple of days ago, which was, the Neanderthals died out, 50,000 years ago, whatever it is, right? They have made some artifacts, which in many cases we don't particularly understand what they were for, whatever it means to say what they were for, because that's involves sort of a thread of purpose that has to be connected to what we're talking about today. I was wondering what would happen if suddenly we discovered, a giant work of literature written by the Neanderthals, how would that change? Because it's kind of like the discovery of an alien intelligence. It happens to be a species intermixed with ours, but it's still something where, what would be understandable? I also, it reminds me of a long ago kind of funny project of video games for pets. It's kind of like if you could have, your cat create, Minecraft or something for cats, and you see, what does the cat make? And, maybe it makes something where you say, that just looks like a random bunch of blocks. I don't know what that is. But to the cat, it's an incredibly meaningful, deep, philosophical, poetic kind
expression.
of thing. Yes, right. But and that's this question of how do you merge kind of what is the human view of things with something broader than the existing human view. And in a sense, it is the goal of science to gradually expand that view, and it's the goal of sort of intellectual development to sort of expand to paradigms which allow you to sort of get further in the space of everything that's possible.
And I think this common link, which is computational physics, is I think critical to understanding how the other species is thinking, right? Because it's, as you mentioned, it's hard as humans to perceive or even begin to conceptualize.
Well, this is the problem. We're all part of the same Ruliad, but we're taking sufficiently different slices. There will be features, for observers like us with computational boundedness and persistence in time. All observers like us in that respect will have some version of general relativity and quantum mechanics. Although their description of it will no doubt be utterly, utterly different from ours. But those kinds of regularities in the world, they will perceive. And I mean, if we did not have certain regularities in the world, it would be hard for us to operate as observers like us. Now, so take away those features, take away persistence in time, and imagine an existence where you have no persistence in time. I don't know what this is like. I mean, I have no idea. There is no memory. There's everything is different at every moment. It's hard to imagine that. I mean, this is why I'm trying to get my science fiction author friends to write about this. So see whether they can find a way to bridge, writing about this in a sort of human understandable way, because it may be profoundly not human understandable. I mean, this is, as a language designer, for example, one of the bad case scenarios is you run into something that just isn't human understandable. You run into something where you cannot present this. You can't figure out a way at this time in history to present this in a way where humans will understand it, so to speak. And that's that's sort of a bad case scenario for language design. Anyway, we should probably wrap up and soon, but you've asked all kinds of interesting things. We've chatted about a pretty broad range of different kinds of topics. Do I sense that there's sort of a one last question here, or did we already do the one last question?
There is. Your feeling is right.
Yeah. So we as at the end we have a section that we call overrated or underrated. So we give you a topic or a statement, and you just give us underrated or overrated. It's a fun section. Okay.
You mean you will give me a topic?
Yeah, or a statement.
Well, please go ahead.
Yeah.
First one, which I would like to know your thoughts about, is Nobel Prize. Do you consider
overrated or underrated?
Yeah.
Anything for which there is a prize is a thing where the most interesting period of its history is probably over. In other words, if there is a field where there's a prize for that field, it means there's a well-defined field, and it means kind of the foundational things are already laid. I mean, I think I have many friends who've won Nobel Prizes. Sometimes it's like they did a bunch of work when they were young, and it's kind of like, wait 40 years and then they'll win a Nobel Prize. And it's sometimes it's actually been very negative for their careers, because
Really?
they kind of, yes, because they kind of like, check mark, I did my science thing. Now, I've got nothing more I can do. I'm never going to top that thing, and I'm just going to wait around, and then I'll get this prize. And I have to say, one friend of mine who won a Nobel Prize, maybe, I don't know, he'd been waiting around for years, okay, for this. I happened to see him, and he has, in his office, he has a box that's labeled Nobel shit. And I said, what is that? He says, it's all the stuff I got when I went to this Nobel Prize, ceremony type thing. And he kind of hated it. So it was sort of an interesting dynamic. So I think it's prizes, you have to understand, prizes are usually more for the giver than for the receiver. So, Alfred Nobel had his reasons for setting up this prize. Mm-hmm. He's mostly dead by the time it really got going. But it's something where I'm always interested, occasionally, actually, I used to win more prizes when I was younger than I do now. And I'm actually fearing the time when I'll start to win all kinds of prizes, because that means people think kind of it's all over, right? It's kind of like
the end of an era.
Yeah, well, it's all over as in, and sort of everything's become well defined enough that it's like, there's a prize for this, there's a prize for that. And I think it's and it's somehow, I'm not a big, again, it's been something, so I would definitely say overrated on that one. There was a period of time when these, which I sort of amused me, there was a period of time when the Ig Nobel Prize, which was this thing about sort of goofy discoveries people have made, got more press than the actual Nobel Prize, and for good reason, because a lot of the actual Nobel Prizes in things like physics were pretty dull. I mean, they were like, I've barely even heard of that discovery. I don't particularly care about it. Now, things have changed in different fields. Like in biology, for example, there are really interesting discoveries getting made all the time there. And that's a place where there's a lot more sort of energy, I would say, generated there. But yeah, so I'm not a big, I think the main statement is, by the time there's a prize for something, it's kind of, the thing is well defined. I had this friend named Benoit Mandelbrot, who's the guy who invented fractals, who was just obsessed with winning prizes for things. And, he campaigned for years to win a Nobel Prize in physics, in economics, and whatever. And I was like, Benoit, why do you care? Like the thing is, but the reason, if there was a prize for fractals, and there may be a prize for fractals now, I don't know, that's kind of a sign that field is now well defined, and sort of the foundational stuff is done.
Right.
It's more interesting, I think, in my particular things I find interesting, to do the foundational stuff than to do the things once the thing is on its track. Very long answer. Try another one. Maybe it'll be a shorter answer.
Yes. You were friends with Steve Jobs, and he gave you the confidence to name Mathematica. You came up with the name, but he brought it up again. He gave you this reason. Apple today it's been almost more than 10 years since Steve Jobs died. Apple today, the technology, the products, what it stands for, overrated or underrated?
I don't know. Apple's a company we've worked with a bunch, but it's interesting. I mean, Apple has taken a particular roadmap of sort of, it's in a sense, it's the UX company, UX, industrial design, etc., and polish everything. They're doing a pretty good job polishing things. I mean, I think it's disappointing that there are, like, I found a memory leak in the Apple Mail program. Okay, that's disappointing, because you would think that the tooling would be good enough that wouldn't be, at least I think it's a memory leak. I'm not certain it's a memory leak. I think it's a memory leak. And but you know, it's interesting that kind of roadmap, that I don't know when Steve Jobs really kind of locked into that roadmap of kind of UX, industrial design, kind of just make things smooth, so to speak. But it's, you know, it's a pretty good roadmap, and there's lots of useful things that come out of it. You know, I think you know, as a company to work with, it's always a bit, when Steve Jobs was alive and there, you could send him mail and he would actually respond and, you know, be pretty direct about things. It's you know, people always used to say about Apple that it was this company full of, you know, secrecy, although it was a ship that leaked from the top, in the sense that Steve would talk about all kinds of things, but everybody else was like, it's got to be secret, secret, secret. And I think you know, as a you know, working with Apple can sometimes be challenging because of that, because the kind of Steve, I think, is a little bit of sort of control and a little bit of showmanship, kind of was very much into this kind of secrecy type thing, and I think that makes it more difficult to work with a company like that.
And you know, I found it surprising that you know, Siri use Wolfram Alpha too, which is when I read it doing some research, it was, you know, it was really cool to see that. But yeah, and then the last one here, we started with college, and I think it will be a good place to end with college as well. And you wrote at one point that you were at a dinner with your son, and Elon Musk happened to be there, and your son went to talk to Elon Musk, and they were talking about college somehow, and then your son, you know, learned from Elon Musk that he went to college, and his whole reason was to pick up girls. So
that was what Elon said. Yeah. Gosh, did I write that somewhere? I thought maybe I told that story, but I didn't think that was out there in the public arena. But yeah, that's the story. It's a true story. Yes.
So the Elon Musk college theory, overrated or underrated?
Gosh, didn't work for me. I met my wife long after I was in college. So you know, and maybe because I went to college earlier than some people, that was it was not college was not my primary social thing, but I certainly it's funny, you know, colleges select certain populations of people, companies select certain populations of people. You know, if you want to find a mate, so to speak, being in a population of people, maybe you want one who's like you, maybe you want one who's the opposite of you. I don't know. It depends on, but that's a, you know. So I don't know. I think that's a that seemed to be observationally, it seems to be. I know at this company, for example, at our company, I'm a little bit shocked at the number of kind of employee. You know, we end up having quite a number of these. We've had many actually over the years of employees getting together like that. I think it's so I'm probably not the expert on this as a I've been kind of I would say that I mean, it is true that one thing I will say is that, you know, in terms of just people one meets and knows and so on, you know, one of the things that I've done is, you know, I've met all kinds of interesting people in my life, and I stay in touch with them, you know, and in fact, I just organized a 50th year reunion for my elementary school class, a virtual reunion, which makes it a lot easier. Most of these people I've sort of been vaguely in touch with at least once a decade since then. But I think one of the things that I've noticed is that people are sometimes very bad at keeping in touch with people that they have known. Maybe it's easier. I don't know in the Facebook generation. Well, you guys are younger than the Facebook generation, but I don't know what the you know, that's old news at this point. But I mean, I don't know whether social media makes it easier for people to feel like they stay connected and actually stay connected to people that they've known in the past. But I would say that one of the things that's been a big positive in my life is that, you know, I've met all kinds of interesting people in my life, and I've stayed in touch with them. And sometimes the funny thing is, I went to an event with a bunch of people from my elementary school back in 2019, and they're people I hadn't seen in 50 years. And what was so strange to me was, start a conversation with them, and you'll realize, I have a decent memory, so I can more or less remember the story. And you'll realize, oh my gosh, this is the same conversation that I had 50 years ago. I'm just picking up, the exact same interaction and conversation that I had 50 years ago. And it seems like one of the things I have noticed is that people, even over quite long periods of time, people will say, oh, I lost touch with that person. I can't get in touch with them again. It tends not to be true. It tends to be the case that you can, at least in my experience, and it's really kind of bizarre. I mean, people that you can have a 50-year gap. We'll see what happens with my virtual reunion. Maybe everybody will be like, they don't know what to say to each other, but we'll see. I don't think that will happen.
And then how do you actually stay in touch with people? Like how do you follow up? And because
I don't know. I send email every so often, and I usually, one thing I tend to do is in modern times when I write stuff, I'll send it to people where I think they might be interested, and that gives me an excuse to kind of have some amount of interaction. But also, I suppose, I keep a list of, when I'm in place X, go and see such and such a person. And, some places where I probably will only be there once in my life, but, there's somebody I know who lives there. And, so I'll, do that. And, that's a pretty typical thing. But somehow, I suppose there's usually, maybe part of the thing for me is that I'm interested in enough things intellectually and business-wise that there'll be a reason why, this person who I knew 30 years ago, whatever, there's some reason to interact with this person. I've got some question I like to ask, or that person has a question they want to ask me, or whatever else. And that gives a sort of excuse to stay in touch, I guess. If it's just the kind of, hey, how are you doing type thing, maybe that doesn't really work. I think I'm probably not great in the hey, how are you doing kind of small talk department. So it tends to be, content very quickly, and it tends to be the people I know tend to be people who are interested in that kind of interaction.
I've done similar stuff where I write essays, and as an excuse, hey, would you mind giving me feedback on this? And it's a way to stay in touch. So. Yeah.
Right. I'm not sure you should ask for feedback. I think it might be better just, you might find this interesting, or this is because I think by the time you give people homework, you're reducing the probability of a response.
Yeah.
Even better. Okay.
It's true.
Thank you for the suggestion. Even better.
Right.
So, but yes, thank you so much for, spending some time with us and really sharing everything that, has made you, who you are in a way. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah. You guys have asked good questions, had good comments. It's been fun. Good stuff. Good work.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Like we started off talking about institutions and colleges, and we ended up learning about some of the deepest questions that the physicists and people around the world are asking today, and some of the puzzles that are still puzzling a lot of us today, and how the tools that we create can help us get closer to the answer. And sometimes the answer might not be intuitive, and something that will only make sense with the tools that get invented after maybe like 100 or 50, after 50 or 150 years from now. So I think the crux is that the most important part of this conversation was that to never stop asking questions. That's how these tools got created. That's how you would find a way to get to the bottom of things. If you never ask the question in the first place, you're not going to be inclined to solve them. So always keep asking questions. I thank you once again for such an amazing opportunity and time with us, and I'll be looking forward to the next
Thanks
conversation.
for your questions. Keep asking them.
Always.
Good stuff. Good.
Thank you, and we will see you next time.